Hey guys, so today I spent a ton of time looking at different tier lists. Tier lists that various streamers, influencers, whatever you might want to call them, people who are well known in the space, they put together for the classes in Lost Ark based on the balance patch and post Theamine. Now, these lists feature Agam, Legalia, ATK, and Bongyoung Park, their tier lists. And I think it's interesting because each of them were kind of crafted in a little bit of different, I guess, formats, ways, and such. So I want to take a look at them and kind of see all the similarities and differences and really analyze like why they put certain classes in certain places because I think that's really important. So I probably spent like 6 to 8 hours a day just like watching and analyzing these tier list videos. But Agam's tier list, his was probably not like the least descriptive, but his wasn't very descriptive in like why he put classes in certain places. He had some descriptions, but not a ton. Legalia, he went pretty in depth for most classes on why he put classes in certain places. Of course, Legalia's opinion is, sometimes construed as being a little bit exaggerated or a little bit biased, but, take it as it is. We're going to take it as it is. And that's why we're also comparing with other people's lists, right? ATK's list was very interesting because he did not just come up with this list by himself. He came up with this list alongside of Judao and a glaver that he did his Theamine clear with. Her name's Hiram, I believe. So it was him, Judao, and Hiram all in one call discussing the tier list. And then the last tier list was by Bongyoung Park, Reaper God. His tier list is a little bit bare bones because his list was not sorted by engravings. He didn't have the engravings on there. Rather, the list had the classes on there and also didn't have every single class on there as well. So there's quite a bit missing from this tier list. So as a result, I'm probably going to be putting a little bit less weight on his tier list. But I think when there's some controversial opinions that come up or like controversial placings, we're going to refer to his tier list as well. So here's the tier list, and I took these tier lists and basically put together my own version of these tier lists, taking into account what everybody put. So one important thing to note is that the point of this video isn't to go in depth with each specific class and each specific engraving and how strong they are. You can go to each of the individual streamers' videos, which I'll list in the description below, to see their opinions and their kind of individual reasons why their classes are put in a certain place. But really, this video is to summarize all of these different tier lists, but also go over the specific ones that are a little bit more controversial or have a little bit more nuance on them. I'm going to give a little bit of a description for every single class, but really, again, don't be surprised if there are some classes where I just say, oh, this class is, considered strong. This class is considered weak, and then just move on beyond that. Now, as you can see over here, I put them into S, A, B, C, D, and the controversial kind of category. This controversial category really is for when the streamers couldn't really, I guess, decide which one they wanted it in. And what I mean by that is one person put it in A, maybe, one person puts it in B, one person puts it in C. There wasn't really much of a consensus amongst them. Now, how I put these together is I looked at the tier list, and basically, if the majority of the folks that I listed earlier put a class in S tier, for example, then that class would go into S. And usually it wasn't that much different. It's like, maybe it was like 3 on S and then 1 on A. It was never really a situation that was like 3 on S and 1 on like C or something like that. If there was kind of a big difference, like I said, I put them here in the controversial. So for the most part, they were pretty consistent with one another. In terms of the ordering of this list, the S tier is pretty set in terms of like what people think, right? I think this is a pretty good description of 1, 2, 3, and 4. But in terms of A, B, and C, I guess maybe even, mostly A and B, these are kind of in quadrants or in sections. Not really quadrants, I get triplets. So it's like The top tier folks are kind of up here. They can kind of like flip back and forth between who's first, who's second, who's third. Mid tier is here. Again, the ordering here doesn't really matter. Lower tier is here. But they're just kind of like within these couple of folks, they can kind of go up and down depending on the person that you're talking about. And I kind of like tried to make sure they're in somewhat of an order based on what they talked about. But in general, they're a little bit fluid because everybody kind of placed them a little bit different in each tier. So let's get started and go down the list. And I think part of this tier list kind of overview, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what I think about them in the context of non-Theamine, right? Because I think all these streamers all talked about these classes in terms of like Theamine, which seems to be a very different fight and a very different game compared to the content that we're going to have, and even in Volus. But surprisingly, for the most part, I would say that these tiers match a lot of what I think, even for the current Volus content. But when there is a class that isn't really, I'd say put in the place that I'd expect them to, or even the streamers themselves called it out, then I'll call it out and then, we'll move it accordingly. But as usual, before we head into this, remember to hit that like button, hit that sub button, leave a ring the bell for notifications, and comment down below on what you think about this video. And as always, I stream every night starting from like, let's just say 10 p.m. PST now, to the end of the night, at www.twitch.tv/misosoup. And, we can discuss this more there. Or if you just want to come and have a good time and talk, feel free to do that. I've been seeing a couple of you pop in there, and that's been really, really great. So let's get started, and let's dive into this. So, on this list, we have Surge Deathblade at the top. And that is no surprise. It seems like most people agreed Surge Deathblade is the #1 class right now. I think the one kind of comment that we had from ATK and Judao is that Surge Deathblade, Judao puts it at the top for sure. ATK, his experience is that Surge Deathblade in Theamine is one of the first classes to get cut from the raids if they're kicking somebody. Because Surge Deathblade, in his opinion, is kind of like New Reaper, or I guess Old Reaper. It is the New Reaper in the sense that if you play it well, you're absolutely cracked. If not, then you're doing pretty bad, and you're probably the source of the problem, and you're not even on the board at all. So that was his opinion, but for the most part, everybody just put him as #1 S, purely because of the damage output. Knight's Edge, I think this was a pretty, I guess, non-controversial opinion. Everybody put it up in S pretty much. They just thought that it brought good damage, it brought good stagger, good counters, good utility, everything. Just very, very good class overall. Same with Hunger. Very, very strong, very good damage, very good utility. It can counter from the back, which is something that no class can do, really, other than that class. And ATK mentioned that in one of his runs, he had, or not his run, one of his runs, but his Theamine clear, basically their Hunger Reaper kind of just carried them throughout the game. So Hunger Reaper's up here because they're very strong, and a class that got buffed a lot. Predator Slayer continues to be one of the strongest classes. Very good damage, very good utility with stagger, counters, everything, good destruction, just overall S tier class. I think ATK's group argued that maybe in terms of damage, it's not like necessarily S tier, but just because of everything else, it is S tier no matter what. And pretty much everybody agreed on this on all fronts. Next, we're going to go into A tier. Eosulfus is one of the ones that I'm going to talk about a little bit because they mentioned, and what everybody mentioned, and what I agree with as well, and I mentioned this in my kind of like roster review video, Eosulfus is a class that you are performing as well as I guess perform, if that makes sense. Your damage output is reflected by how well you're performing, how well you're doing. The class itself is very hard to play. So if you are a good player, understand the fight very well, and understand your class very well, you will be in S tier. And they've said this. It is an S tier class if you are absolutely cracked at this game. If you suck at this class, you're probably down here in B tier, bottom of B tier, if not even lower. So they made a compromise and put him in A, top of A. I agree. Now, Full Moon Harvester, this is at the top of A And some people put it a little bit lower, some people put it a little higher. And mainly that is because it is a very support reliant class, much like Igniter Sork. Now, it's stronger than Igniter Sork, also provides a lot more utility, but in order to reach its full maximum potential, you will need to be pocketed by a support, let's say a Bard. All right, Pinnacle Glaver, AT Scouter, Death Strike, Sharpshooter, all of them agreed. Very strong classes overall, good utility, brings good damage, good class. Same with the Enhanced Weapon Deadeye, very strong class. Entropy class, they would say that in the more mobile fights, it's definitely harder to play Entropy, harder to play this, which I agree with, but in general, still a very good class. Robust, I have a little bit of personal bias on this because I play Robust, but in general, they did put this in A tier, around middle of A tier. I personally might put this a little bit lower, but that's just because I think that in terms of utility, it's a little bit awkward sometimes because when you're out of hype, you really can't do anything. So sometimes a stagger check happens or a destruction window happens and you're out of hype. You're not contributing anything to that. And if not, then you'd have to hold your hype for that mechanic, and that's a loss in DPS. So I would personally put it a little bit lower, but they put it up here, which, you know, again, this is a compilation of their opinions, right? We have War Dancer, SO War Dancer. They all thought it was very strong class still. Very, with the new kind of buffs to the, or not buffs, but changes to War Dancer, you have 100% uptime on your crit synergy and attack speed synergy. So very sought out in raids, still very strong. Emperor Arcana. This is one that I would say has a little bit of controversy, not really controversy to it. Everybody put it in A, but something that Ju Dao had mentioned in his in ATK's video is that Emperor Arcana, in terms of damage, should be around PS Gunslinger or PM Gunslinger. But the reason why he puts it up here is because in Theamine, he contributes a lot with the stagger, but also the fact that the boss stays still so often, his damage goes way up because evokes require the boss to, you know, it requires some time to actually proc, right? So if a boss is moving around a lot, it's a lot harder to land your evokes. But with Theamine Gate 4 being a lot more of a stationary boss, you can land those evokes and get your damage out. So I personally, outside of Theamine, would probably move this down a little bit. Let's just say, you know, he said that the damage is around PM Gunslinger, right? Let's just move it down here to B tier. Because I still think it's a stronger class than Gunslinger at the moment. But again, not that strong if the DPS really is around PM Gunslinger. Next, we have RE Deathblade. Now this one is actually a little bit of surprise. Well, I'm not really surprised, but with kind of like before the during the PTR and like the results people were getting, it is a bit surprising that it's not on the same tier as Surge Deathblade. But one of the streamers, Agam, or I guess YouTubers Agam, mentioned that you can probably get this amount of damage if you're absolutely nutty with the class. He said that probably the top 20 folks playing this class might be able to do that, but you know, other than that, it's probably going to be an A tier. Overall, it seems like it's just a very much jack of all trades classes, and that you know, damage wise, it can be a strong surge, but in the most cases, you're probably not going to be that strong. Now, here is Red Gun Lancer, and people didn't put him up here really for damage, other than like, I think Ju Dao. People put him up here because of the utility that he brought to the raids, which I agree. Damage-wise, he's probably maybe down here at B tier, in my opinion. Some people would say less. I think it's probably B tier. But the thing is, Ju Dao also mentioned that if you don't run Nalesha's, the shield that you give your entire party, you get an extra damage skill. And he says he just out-DPS most of the DPS characters in the game if you do that. Which, you know, probably true. But at the same time, how often are you going to do that? Pretty much maybe 10%, 5% of the raids that you're doing, maybe homework raids. If you're doing actual, raids that are on item level like that, you're never gonna have a red gun lancer that's running that type of build. They're always gonna be running militias. So I would say that while I think that definitely the ceiling is at that point in most situations, it won't be that way. But he's A for those reasons. Barrage artillerists got a huge buff. Their damage, basically window, their burst window got reduced by a ton, and as a result, they're doing a lot of damage, and that's why he is up here in A. Perfect suppression. This is a little bit more controversial, but in general, most people had him in A because it does decent damage. It's not bad, but is a little bit of a jack of all trades and is able to, bring good stagger, bring good destruction, has a good counter, is a hitmaster class, just a class that you'd want in general in your raid. So that's why they put him up here. Damage, not bad, but not top tier. But what really pushes him up here is the utility. Lunar Reaper. Unfortunately, a little bit of an ugly duckling sister type of situation to the Hunger Reaper. It brings no utility, pretty much. Damage is lower. In general, you're really only playing Lunar Reaper because you like the playstyle. Everything else is much inferior. Far inferior to Hunger. Now, on to Empress Arcana. And this was another one that was a little bit controversial, along with Emperor Arcana, as I mentioned earlier. Empress Arcana, they were saying that in Theamine, it is very hard to play Empress because burst classes just aren't as strong in Theamine. Additionally, Legalia mentioned that it's very hard to stand close to the boss as an Empress Arcana. So a lot of times you're not able to DPS as well as, the Emperor Arcana, who can be pretty long range. So that's why they put it in B tier. But in terms of damage, they said that it is one of the strongest classes, the strongest damaging classes in the game. So because of that, I would probably bring Empress for our content up into B tier or A tier. Probably the top of A tier. They mentioned that it's one of the strongest classes in terms of damage. So A tier is probably where it belongs for our content. Now, they also mentioned that, stagger, utility and things like that were weaker than Emperor Arcana as well. That's why they had it a little bit lower. Again, I think for us, that's a little bit less important. But it seems like for Theamine, those kind of mechanics and, utility really is super important. So, again, another reason why they ordered it that way. Now, next, Rage Hammer Destroyer. It seems like Rage Hammer Destroyer has a pretty good place in Theamine. Theamine, again, is it stands still pretty often, so it's pretty easy to hit those front attacks. But also, they reduce the amount of damage you take, or the amount of meter that you gain from meter gaining abilities. So in Theamine, it's really strong. I think for us, it might be a little bit lower. I think it's still in B, but probably down here. So yeah, strong class. Mayhem Berserker, strong class overall, but I think that they just mentioned it's sometimes a little bit awkward in certain windows because you're a constant DPS class, and when you're doing staggers, you have to use your damage skills to stagger. It's a little bit awkward, but still a very strong class. Esoteric Flurry, strong class. Punisher Slayer, they mentioned that this is a class with a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows. So if you're performing well and the fight is easy, this class absolutely pumps in damage. But for the most part, it's a very clunky class, and it's kind of hard to play because of that. You have to chase the back, you're kind of slow, you're a spec class, and you're kind of like a Sork, but you need to land your back attacks. But you do have, very, very respectable damage. So for that reason, it's here in B tier. Loyal Companion, very consistent class. Pistolier, very consistent class. The Aeromancers, very consistent classes as well. Provides good synergy, good utility with stagger, counters, destruction, all those things. So it's up here. Now, with Summoner, they talked a little bit about... this was also a little bit controversial. Not super controversial. Again, it's on here for a reason because most people agreed it was at B. But their ATK's group did put Summoner in A tier, Master Summoner at least. They didn't really explain why it was in A tier. They didn't talk about too much, but they just mentioned that it had pretty good damage, good utility with stagger, destruction, and the real pitfalls of the class really is that it is slower, doesn't really have much mobility, and yeah, kind of like the casting animations were really slow, right? So they didn't really mention too much, but for the most part, people said it was in B tier, low B tier. Same with Igniter, another class that is very slow and awkward to play. And with kind of the content that we have in the game right now, other than a con, you're a lot of times not hitting that second Doomsday. At least it's very hard to because the bosses are so mobile, right? So if you're not hitting that second Doomsday, Judao said you're missing about 30% of your damage in your Igniter. So as a result of that, they're not doing that much damage. On top of not doing much damage, they don't have a lot of utility because they don't really bring much stagger. They don't really bring too much destruction compared to a lot of the other classes, and a lot of them don't run a counter. So utility is very low. Damage is kind of low because of the design of the bosses. But if you're in a raid like a con, then your stocks would go higher. But for the most part, things are very mobile and it's very hard to play Igniter Sorc. Now, CO Summoner is a little bit of a weird one because nobody really mentioned why they put it here in B tier and not C or D. They just kind of said, like, other than Legalia, I guess, who has basically put him way lower, they're like, it doesn't really do as much damage as Master Summoner, but brings the same amount of utility, I guess. So that's why they put him up here. At least that's what I understood from their comments. Evolution Scouter, it's very survivable, very tanky, can do decent damage, not amazing damage, but okay damage, more so than demonic. But again, it is a class that needs a little bit of help in terms of damage, but that's understandable given that it's a 2-gem class with no tripods. BT Berserker. Now, this was an interesting one because originally, when ATK had started their tier list, they had talked about how BT Berserker in Judao's party, they had one that was outperforming one of the, I believe, Punisher Slayers in the party. Either that or it was like they had not been on Family Portrait before, and then when they swapped from Mayhem to BT, they actually got Cruel Fighter and the top DPS. So he was like, well, if you're playing at the top of the top, Berserker, BT Berserker, actually A tier. But in most cases, in most people's cases, it is probably going to be C tier. Now, they also compared BT with Mayhem, and the reason why they have it in this order is because BT a lot of times is a lot slower because it's a spec class, and as a result, a little bit more clunky. So it's a lot harder to dodge attacks, dodge mechanics, things like that. Just because of that, they put it down a notch. And most other streamers, again, had it at C tier as well. Control Glaive, Swiftness class, chasing the back. Unfortunately, just not as strong as Pinnacle Glaver. Peacemaker, Gunslinger. Unfortunately, they kind of have the short end of the stick. Their damage is not great, and their changes didn't really help them too much. Firepower. This was a little bit tough. I think this is a little bit like BT Berserker as well, in that there's not that many representatives. So it's a little bit hard for people to tell how strong this class is. But for the most part, from what they've seen, it is not a very strong class. Now, combat readiness, Gunlancer, not a very strong class. Doesn't do much damage. In terms of speed, ATK said he prefers Red Lancer because Red Lancer runs swift and combat readiness does not, so it's a little more clunky to play. Just in general, not as good as Red Gun Lancer. That's why they have him down here. Now D, these were the classes they said, please help them out. Demonic Impulse, Shadowhunter. It can do a lot of the mechanics. It's a mech doer, has good utility, but just doesn't do any damage, unfortunately. They need help. Reflex Sorc, same thing, doesn't do much damage, In terms of utility, I think Judao's and ATK, their group said that they basically do as much stagger and destruction as Igniter Sork because people don't really run the boundless mana build in Korea. They just run casting reflux. So it's about the same thing as Igniter Sork. So they don't bring utility and they don't do damage. So that's why they're down here. Time to Hut was an interesting one, actually. So ATK's group actually had Time to Hunt in B tier. Now that is very interesting. They said that Time to Hunt Gunslinger, when it runs the dual tripods, has some very good damage and burst windows. And what they mean by that, they said like compression, damage compression. And I think what they mean by that is that it takes a lot less time for their damage to come out compared to PM Gunslinger. So they actually put TTH above PM Gunslinger and put it in B tier. But for the most part, everybody else put it in D tier. I think the class is underperforming and doesn't do as much damage. But maybe it does have those better damage windows compared to PM because PM, the gunslingers, the shotguns just take a long time to come out. But PM does also have a better utility with stagger with the shotguns. Now, unfortunately, the big loser goes to GT. GT Destroyer. And they were on the bottom of the list because the class engraving is, while very fun, it's very unreasonable to expect a boss to stand still for 20 seconds. And I think that's been the case forever. So that is the list that everybody basically agreed on. Everybody, in the terms of the majority, had agreed that these were the tiers and where the class sat. But there were a couple that were a little bit more controversial, and I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about these ones. The first one is going to be Shock Scrapper. So Shock Scrapper, it's a little bit controversial because of the places that they put them. So Legalia put Shock Scrapper in A tier. ATK put Shock Scrapper in B tier, and Agam put Shock Scrapper in S tier. So that's quite a bit of a spread. So Legalia said Shock Scrapper, the reason why they're A tier and not S tier like Tie Scrapper is because they really need the attack speed and crit synergy, but it's pretty much unplayable without it. So he puts that in A tier. ATK said that Shock is a little bit less consistent than Tie Scrapper in terms of damage and utility. And Agam didn't really give an explanation, just said Shock is above Tie. And I think before we move to like putting these in a tier list, I'm going to move on to Tie as well because Legalia put that as S, Bongyoung Park put that as S, and ATK and Agam put it as A. So there's a little bit of kind of like some people put an S, some people put an A. It's a 50-50, right? So Legalia said that Tie Scrapper is basically outperforming Predator Slayer and can compete with Hunger as well in terms of damage. They have very good utility too, and that's why it's S tier. Bongyoung Park put an S, didn't really give an explanation though. He basically just said this is a strong class and people who are good at their class are probably still, people who are good at Tie Scrapper are probably still playing it, and that's why it's strong. ATK said that the reason why the Tie Scrapper is an A tier is because it has very good utility, it's very reliable and survivable, and is a very dependable class. But he never really discussed the DPS. And Agam didn't really put an explanation, as I mentioned. He has put Shock above Tie. So given kind of Legalia, his explanation, and Bongyoung Park's opinion as well, I would probably put this in S tier is my kind of inclination because Legalia did kind of talk a little, gave some kind of reasoning, right? And I think the fact that it has good utility, it's very reliable, very survivable, I think that is all very, very strong characteristics of the class. And I think for the most part, most people do consider Tie Scrapper, the new Tie Scrapper, in A tier. Or S tier. So we'll put it at the bottom of the S tier. Now, Shock Scrapper, Again, Legalia is really kind of the only one that really made any kind of real analysis of the class. And again, Agam didn't really give an explanation, but ATK did give a little bit, and ATK put it at B. So, given that Legalia and ATK did give explanations as to why they're in their respective tiers, I'm probably going to put this in A tier, agreeing more with Legalia and ATK. But we're not going to put it in B because Agam gave it an S, right? So we're just going to even it out, average it out. We're going to put it in A tier. Now, another controversial one was Deathblow Striker. And this is my main, so I'm going to give my opinion on it as well. But they talked about Deathblow as being, well, ATK said Deathblow's B tier. Legalia said it's S tier. Agam and Bongyoung Park put it as A tier, but didn't really give much of an explanation as to why neither of them did. The reason why Legalia said it's S tier is because there was a big damage buff to the class, and there's a huge synergy buff with the crit and attack speed synergies that they gave them now, and it's up 100%. ATK said that he never sees them in the family portrait unless they're absolutely cracked, like Mintoror, who he plays with. Says also, Umar Laz, their card set, makes doing mechs very, very awkward. And Striker players don't want to do mechs. So he actually really hates playing with Striker players because most of the time they're not really mech doers. All they do is try to do the most damage and try to avoid mechs as much as possible. And they also said that counters in Theamine having paralysis immunity is very important. So while Strikers have a very good counter right now, in Theamine it's actually not that strong. And a lot of times in Theamine, if you miss that counter, you just die. So because it doesn't have paralysis immunity, they get knocked out of it very often, and they just die. So those are the reasons why that he would put Striker in B tier. I'm probably going to be putting it in A tier for our content especially, because we don't have to worry about that paralysis immunity as much. And doing mechs isn't as important for us right now. But I think in Theamine, again, mechs are probably going to be very, very important. But for us, for now, I think I'd put Striker at the bottom of A tier, just because I do think, it did get a big buff to the class in terms of damage, but also that crit synergy and attack speed synergy is very valuable for any party. So I think it's still an A tier class. Now, it is frustrating to have that Umar Laz thing. As a Striker player, I'm personally a mech doer. I just do the mechs and don't care about Umar Laz. But I have played the class as a non-mech doer at one time, and it was very strong. But for the most part, I want to be a mech doer and want to contribute to the party, so the damage isn't as strong as it could be. But yeah, so A tier. I think it's at the bottom of A tier, if not maybe a little bit higher, maybe middle of A tier. That's where I'd put Striker. And finally, we have first intentional war dancer. Now, this was pretty controversial because it's not because there was spread in terms of some people said S, some people said A, some people said B. It's that Legalia and Bongyoung Park both put FI as at the top tier in S tier, and pretty high in S tier too. But both ATK and Agam put FI in B tier. So here's the reasoning. Legalia basically says FI shits out damage. Their buff just made them way overtuned, and they do way too much damage now, and it's super easy to do damage. Bongyoung Park, again, didn't really give it much explanation, just said there were strong changes. ATK's group said SO has more damage, and also good stagger, but FI is more consistent and has better buffs, but lower damage. But I guess the amount of damage that SO does over FI makes the difference here. Now, Agam said something weird that I didn't really understand. He said that they got a slight buff to their damage, but because of the increase in gimmicks with the recent content, he's going to put it in B. What I think gimmicks is, or at least what I thought it was that gimmicks are more of transition patterns or kind of stagger checks or, things you have to do mechs basically, right? But from what I understand of the game, when there's more mechs, when there's more stagger checks, things like that, burst classes are king. So I'm not really sure what he means by gimmicks. So yeah, I don't really understand. But given that we have two S's and two B's, let's just put it a compromise and put it in A, somewhere in the middle of A. So that is my analysis of their tier list. Again, spent a lot of time on this, basically 6 to 7 hours today, listening, really diving in deep into why they put certain classes in certain tiers, and we came out with this tier list. So this is what I would say, in my opinion, a not definitive tier list, but it's a pretty good tier list for, bringing together a bunch of minds' opinions, right? Again, we had ATK along with Ju Dao, and I believe is Hedam was the other person, the Glavier who was in his party for his Theamine clear. And then we had Legalia, of course, and then we had Agam and Bongyoung Park. So this is a compilation, again, of their tier lists, which I will list here again on this screen so you guys can take a look at where they specifically put each of their classes. And yeah, hopefully you guys liked this video. Hopefully it was informative. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, I did put a little bit of my opinions in there, but for the most part, I try to keep it as objective as possible and only adhere to where they put their classes. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, as always, hit that like button, hit the sub button, ring the bell for notifications, and leave a comment down below for with your thoughts. And as always, I stream every night, 10 p.m. PST, twitch.tv/misosoup. Come. And I hope to see you guys there. And as always, if not, I'll see y'all on the next one. Peace out.